Martha Whitmore clutched her worn shawl tighter as she watched her father count the grain sacks with trembling hands. The autumn wind whistled through the gaps in their cabin walls, carrying with it the scent of impending winter and desperation. Her stomach had been empty for 2 days, and the hollow ache had become as familiar as breathing. Thomas Whitmore's weathered face bore the weight of impossible choices as he glanced between his 17-year-old daughter and the meager supplies that wouldn't last another week. "Pa, there has to be another way," Martha whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. She had overheard the hushed conversations between her parents, the way they stopped talking whenever she entered the room. The drought had destroyed their crops for the third consecutive year, and their neighbors had already begun the long journey west, abandoning homesteads that could no longer sustain life. Thomas avoided her gaze, his calloused hands fidgeting with his hat brim. "Child, sometimes the Lord tests us in ways we can't understand. The Hendersons, they've made a fair offer. You'd have a roof over your head, food in your belly, and work to keep you busy." His words sounded rehearsed, as if he'd been practicing them for days. Martha's heart sank as the reality of her situation crystallized. The Henderson family owned the largest farm in 3 counties, and their reputation for treating workers poorly was well known throughout the territory. But worse than that was the implication behind her father's carefully chosen words. She wasn't being offered employment. She was being traded like livestock, her future sold for enough grain to keep her parents alive through the harsh winter months ahead. "How much grain, Pa?" she asked quietly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She needed to know her worth, needed to understand the exact price of her freedom. "Enough to see us through till spring planting," he replied, his voice breaking on the last word. "Maybe enough to buy seed if we're careful." Martha walked to the small window and gazed out at the barren fields that had once promised prosperity. In the distance, she could see smoke rising from chimneys in town, where families with means were preparing warm meals and planning for the future. The inequality of their circumstances felt like a physical weight pressing down on her chest. She had always known they were poor, but she had never imagined that poverty could reduce a human being to a commodity. Her mother, Eleanor, emerged from the back room where she had been mending clothes by candlelight. Her once bright eyes were now sunken and tired, aged beyond her 43 years by hardship and worry. "Martha, dear, we wouldn't do this if there was any other choice. The Hendersons promised you'd be treated well, and maybe in time you could earn enough to help us get back on our feet." The unspoken truth hung heavy in the air between them. They all knew that once Martha left with the Hendersons, she would likely never return to this cabin. The arrangement was permanent, a solution born of desperation that would separate her from everything she had ever known. The Henderson wagon arrived at dawn, its wooden wheels creaking against the frozen ground as it rolled up the narrow path to the Whitmore cabin. Martha had spent the sleepless night packing her few belongings into a cloth bundle: two faded dresses, a pair of worn boots, her mother's old Bible, and a small silver locket that had belonged to her grandmother. These meager possessions represented the entirety of her material existence. Samuel Henderson climbed down from the driver's seat, his imposing frame casting a long shadow across the frost-covered yard. At 45, he was a man accustomed to getting his way, whether through intimidation or manipulation. His cold blue eyes surveyed the Whitmore property with obvious disdain, taking note of the sagging roof, the broken fence posts, and the general air of defeat that permeated the homestead. "Whitmore," he called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never known true want. "I trust the girl is ready. My wife has a full day of work planned, and we can't afford delays." Thomas emerged from the cabin, his shoulders stooped with shame. Behind him, Martha appeared in the doorway, her chin raised in a gesture of defiance that belied her fear. She had made a decision during the long night hours. If she was to be traded like property, she would at least maintain her dignity in the transaction. "She's ready," Thomas said quietly, unable to meet his daughter's eyes. "Martha's a hard worker, Mr. Henderson. She won't give you any trouble." Henderson's gaze fixed on Martha, evaluating her like he would inspect a horse at market. "She looks strong enough. Can she cook, clean, tend animals?" "Yes, sir," Martha answered for herself, her voice clear and steady. "I can do whatever work needs doing." The businessman nodded curtly and gestured toward the wagon. "Load your things. We leave now." As Martha approached the wagon, her father finally found the courage to look at her directly. In his eyes, she saw a mixture of love, regret, and desperate hope. He pressed a small pouch into her hand, their family's last few coins, saved for emergencies that had never seemed as dire as this moment. "Write to us when you can," Eleanor whispered, embracing her daughter with fierce intensity. "Remember that we love you no matter what happens." Martha climbed into the wagon bed, settling herself among sacks of feed and farming equipment. As they pulled away from the only home she had ever known, she watched her parents grow smaller in the distance until they were just two dark figures against the gray morning sky. The weight of her situation pressed down on her chest like a physical burden. The Henderson farm was a 3-hour journey through increasingly prosperous countryside. Along the way, Martha observed the stark differences between her family's desperate circumstances and the comfortable lives of others. Well-maintained houses dotted the landscape, their windows glowing with warm lamplight and their yards filled with healthy livestock. The inequality felt like a cruel joke played by fate. The Henderson farmhouse loomed before Martha like a fortress of prosperity, its two-story structure dwarfing her family's modest cabin. Smoke curled from multiple chimneys, and the sound of children's laughter drifted from an upstairs window. For a moment, Martha allowed herself to hope that perhaps her circumstances might not be as dire as she had imagined. The building represented stability and comfort that she had never experienced. Constance Henderson appeared on the front porch, her austere expression immediately dispelling any optimism Martha might have harbored. The woman's gray hair was pulled back severely, and her black dress gave her the appearance of a perpetual mourner. Her sharp eyes assessed Martha with the calculating gaze of someone evaluating a potential investment. "So this is the Whitmore girl," Constance said, her voice carrying no warmth. "She looks scrawny, Samuel. Are you certain she'll be worth the grain we paid?" Martha felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, but she kept her expression neutral. She had resolved not to give these people the satisfaction of seeing her broken spirit, regardless of how they chose to treat her. "She'll do," Samuel replied dismissively. "The family was desperate enough to accept our terms without negotiation. That suggests she'll be compliant." Constance circled Martha like a predator studying prey, noting every detail of her appearance and demeanor. "Your hair is too long and impractical for kitchen work. We'll cut it short. Those clothes are unsuitable. You'll wear the uniform we provide. And you'll address me as Mrs. Henderson and my husband as Mr. Henderson. Is that understood?" "Yes, ma'am," Martha replied, forcing politeness into her voice despite the anger building inside her chest. "Ma'am," Constance's eyebrows rose sharply. "Did I stutter? You will address me as Mrs. Henderson. We are not your friends or family. You are here to work, nothing more." Martha's jaw clenched, but she nodded. "Yes, Mrs. Henderson." The woman led her through the house, pointing out rooms and rattling off an extensive list of daily responsibilities. Martha would be responsible for cooking all meals, cleaning the entire house, tending the vegetable garden, caring for the chickens, washing and mending clothes, and assisting with any other tasks the family deemed necessary. Her day would begin before dawn and end well after sunset. "You'll sleep in the root cellar," Constance announced, opening a narrow door that revealed a set of steep wooden steps leading into darkness below. "It's warm enough and keeps you close to the kitchen for early morning preparations." Martha peered into the cramped space that would serve as her living quarters. The ceiling was so low that she would have to stoop while standing, and the air carried the musty smell of stored vegetables and dampness. A thin mattress lay on the dirt floor, accompanied by a single blanket and a small wooden crate that would serve as her dresser. The reality of her situation struck her with full force. She wasn't a hired worker. She was essentially an indentured servant, trapped by her family's desperate circumstances and the Hendersons' willingness to exploit those circumstances for their benefit. "Supper preparation begins in 1 hour," Constance continued, seemingly oblivious to Martha's distress. The family expects meals to be served promptly and prepared to our standards. Failure to meet expectations will result in reduced rations for you. Martha's first week at the Henderson farm passed in a blur of backbreaking labor and constant criticism. She rose each morning at 4 o'clock to stoke the kitchen fire and begin breakfast preparations for the family of 6. The Hendersons had 4 children ranging in age from 8 to 16, each one seemingly trained to treat Martha with the same dismissive attitude their parents displayed. The work was relentless and varied. After serving breakfast and cleaning the kitchen, Martha would tend to the chickens, collect eggs, milk the cow, and begin preparations for the midday meal. Afternoons were spent washing clothes by hand in the frigid creek water, mending torn garments, cleaning the house from top to bottom, and working in the vegetable garden despite the approaching winter weather. Constance Henderson found fault with everything Martha did. The floors weren't clean enough, the bread wasn't kneaded properly, the laundry wasn't hung correctly, the garden rows weren't straight enough. Each criticism was delivered with sharp words and increasingly harsh consequences. When Martha accidentally broke a plate on her third day, Constance docked her already meager food rations for a week. "Clumsy girl," Constance had hissed, sweeping up the ceramic fragments with exaggerated disgust. "That plate was part of my grandmother's china set. You'll work extra hours until you've earned enough to replace it." Martha soon realized that the replacement cost would take months to earn at the rate the Hendersons claimed to be paying her. Not that she ever saw actual money. Her wages were supposedly being held to cover her room and board, with any remainder saved for her future needs. The arrangement ensured that she remained completely dependent on their goodwill for survival. The worst part wasn't the physical exhaustion or even the constant hunger that gnawed at her empty stomach. It was the way the family spoke about her as if she weren't present, discussing her shortcomings and planning additional work assignments while she served their meals. They treated her like a piece of equipment rather than a human being with feelings and dignity. Samuel Henderson proved to be no better than his wife, though his cruelty took different forms. He would stand uncomfortably close while giving her instructions, his breath hot against her neck as he detailed her failures. His hands would linger when passing her items, and his eyes followed her movements with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "You're not in Kansas anymore, girl," he said one evening after cornering her in the barn while she finished the evening milking. "Out here, people like you don't have choices. You do what you're told when you're told, and you're grateful for the opportunity." Martha pressed herself against the cow's warm flank, putting distance between herself and Samuel's leering presence. "I understand, Mr. Henderson. I'm grateful for the work." His laugh was cold and calculating. "Grateful, that's good. Gratitude will serve you well here." That night, lying on her thin mattress in the root cellar, Martha stared at the wooden ceiling beams and fought back tears of frustration and despair. The silver locket around her neck, her grandmother's final gift, seemed to grow heavier with each passing day, a reminder of the loving family she had lost and the uncertain future that stretched ahead of her. She began planning her escape, though she knew the odds were against her. Winter was approaching. She had no money, and the nearest town was a full day's walk through dangerous territory. 3 weeks into her servitude, Martha encountered the first sign that her situation might eventually change. She was hanging laundry behind the farmhouse when she noticed a lone rider approaching from the eastern trail. Even from a distance, there was something different about this traveler. He sat his horse with easy confidence, and his presence seemed to command attention without effort. As the rider drew closer, Martha could see that he was a Native American man, though his clothing was a mixture of traditional and European styles. He wore buckskin leggings and a wool shirt, with his long black hair tied back and adorned with feathers. Most striking were his eyes, dark and intelligent. They seemed to take in everything around him with careful assessment. Samuel Henderson emerged from the barn, his usual bluster notably absent as he approached the visitor. Martha had never seen her employer show deference to anyone, but something about this man's bearing commanded respect, even from the arrogant farmer. "Morning," Samuel called out, his voice carefully neutral. "What brings you to our property?" The rider dismounted with fluid grace, his movements economical and purposeful. When he spoke, his English was perfect, tinged with only the slightest accent. "I am James Crow Feather of the Choctaw Nation. I'm traveling through to the territorial capital on tribal business. I was hopping to water my horse and perhaps purchase some supplies." Martha found herself drawn to listen to the conversation, though she continued hanging clothes to avoid drawing attention. There was something compelling about this man's quiet dignity, especially in contrast to the Hendersons' usual bombastic behavior. Of course," Samuel replied, though his discomfort was obvious. "Water's free, and my wife might have some bread and preserved meat she could spare. For a fair price, naturally." James Crow Feather's gaze swept across the farmyard, taking note of the well-maintained buildings, the healthy livestock, and the general signs of prosperity. His eyes paused briefly on Martha, and she felt a strange sensation, as if he was seeing more than just a servant girl hanging laundry. "I appreciate your hospitality," he said to Samuel, though his attention remained partially focused on Martha's activities. "It's not often I encounter such generosity from settlers in this region." There was something in his tone that suggested he was aware of the irony in his words. Martha risked a glance in his direction and found him watching her with an expression of quiet concern. For a moment, Their eyes met across the yard, and she felt a connection she couldn't quite understand. Constance Henderson appeared on the porch, her sharp voice cutting through the morning air. "Martha, stop gawking and finish your work. Those clothes won't hang themselves." The embarrassment burned hot in Martha's cheeks, but James Crow Feather's expression never changed. If anything, his eyes hardened slightly as he observed the interaction between Martha and her employers. "That's quite a lot of work for one person," he commented casually to Samuel. "Your hired girl seems very dedicated." Samuel's laugh was forced and uncomfortable. "Oh, she's not hired help. Family arrangement, you might say. The girl's family owed us money, and this is how she's working it off." Martha's hands stilled on the clothesline as she heard her situation reduced to such simple, dismissive terms. The shame of her circumstances felt overwhelming in the presence of this dignified stranger who seemed to see through the Hendersons' casual cruelty. James Crow Feather accepted the Hendersons' offer of supplies with polite gratitude, but Martha noticed that his movements around the farmyard were deliberately slow and observant. While Samuel fetched water for his horse and Constance gathered food supplies, the Choctaw man found opportunities to position himself where he could observe Martha's interactions with the family. During the midday meal preparation, Martha was required to serve the guest along with the Henderson family. As she placed a plate of bread and preserved venison before James Crow Feather, he spoke quietly enough that only she could hear. "Thank you for your service," he said, his words carrying weight beyond simple politeness. "It's clear you work very hard." Martha nodded, not trusting herself to speak without revealing the emotions churning inside her chest. His kindness felt foreign after weeks of constant criticism and dismissal. Constance Henderson's voice cracked like a whip across the dining room. "Martha, stop lingering and fetch more coffee. Our guest's cup is nearly empty." As Martha hurried to comply, she caught James Crow Feather watching the exchange with those penetrating dark eyes. When she returned with the coffee pot, he engaged Samuel in conversation about local farming conditions, but his attention periodically shifted to observe how the family treated their servant. "The territorial government has been discussing labor practices lately," James mentioned casually while accepting his coffee refill. "There's growing concern about the treatment of indentured workers, particularly young women in isolated farming communities." Samuel's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "Is that so? Can't say I've heard much discussion about it in these parts." "Perhaps it hasn't reached this area yet," James replied smoothly. "But the tribal nations have been working with territorial officials to address situations where people might be taken advantage of due to economic desperation. It's a matter of basic human dignity." The words hung in the air with unmistakable significance. Martha felt a flutter of something she hadn't experienced in weeks: hope. This stranger was sending a message, though she wasn't sure what he intended to do about her situation. After the meal, James Crow Feather prepared to continue his journey. As he secured his supplies to his saddle, he approached Martha, who was scraping plates in the kitchen yard. "Miss," he said quietly, his voice pitched for her ears only, "I will be returning through this area in approximately 2 weeks. I travel the Eastern Trail regularly on tribal business." Martha looked up, meeting his steady gaze. "Yes, sir. If circumstances here become unbearable," he continued, "there are people who can help. The Choctaw Nation maintains relationships with territorial officials who take interest in cases of exploitation." Before Martha could respond, Samuel Henderson appeared around the corner of the house, his expression suspicious. "Everything all right here? Martha, you should be starting preparations for supper." "Of course," James replied smoothly, swinging up into his saddle. "I was simply thanking the young lady for the excellent meal. Your household is well managed, Henderson." As he rode away, Martha watched until he disappeared beyond the eastern hills. For the first time since arriving at the Henderson farm, she felt as though someone had truly seen her situation for what it was. More importantly, someone with apparent influence and connections had noticed the injustice of her circumstances. That evening, as she lay on her thin mattress in the root cellar, Martha clutched her grandmother's locket and allowed herself to imagine a different future. The 2 weeks following James Crow Feather's visit passed with agonizing slowness. Martha found herself scanning the eastern horizon each morning, hopping to catch sight of a familiar rider approaching through the autumn landscape. The memory of his quiet dignity and implied promise sustained her through increasingly difficult days. Samuel Henderson's behavior toward Martha had grown more aggressive since the stranger's visit. He seemed to sense that someone had taken notice of their treatment of her, and his response was to assert his authority more forcefully. He assigned additional tasks, criticized her work more harshly, and found excuses to be present whenever she worked alone. "That Indian was asking too many questions," he muttered one morning while Martha prepared breakfast. "People need to mind their own business and stay out of affairs that don't concern them." Constance nodded in agreement, her sharp features twisted with disapproval. "Foreigners always think they understand our ways better than we do, as if they have any right to judge how Christian families manage their households." The irony of calling a member of the continent's original inhabitants a foreigner wasn't lost on Martha, but she kept her thoughts to herself. Speaking out would only invite punishment, and she was already surviving on reduced rations due to various alleged infractions. On the 14th day after James Crow Feather's visit, Martha's hope began to waver. Perhaps she had misunderstood his words, or maybe his tribal business had taken him in a different direction. The possibility that she had imagined a rescue that would never come felt crushing. But late that afternoon, while she was splitting kindling behind the woodshed, Martha heard the unmistakable sound of approaching hoofbeats. Her heart raced as she recognized the steady rhythm of a single horse moving at an unhurried pace. Dropping the axe, she moved to where she could see the eastern trail without being observed from the house. James Crow Feather appeared exactly as she remembered him, dignified, alert, and somehow radiating an aura of quiet authority. This time, however, he wasn't alone. A second rider accompanied him, a white man in official territorial clothing who carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to respect and obedience. The two men approached the Henderson farmhouse with purposeful determination. Martha watched from her hiding place as Samuel emerged to greet them, his usual bluster notably absent in the face of what appeared to be official business. "Mr. Henderson," the territorial official called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "I'm Marshal William Brady, and this is James Crow Feather, who serves as a liaison between the territorial government and the tribal nations. We need to discuss your current labor arrangements." Samuel's face paled visibly. "I'm not sure what you mean, Marshal. All our workers are treated according to territorial law." "That's what we're here to determine," Marshal Brady replied curtly. "We've received reports of questionable labor practices involving a young woman named Martha Whitmore. I believe she's currently working on your property." Martha's heart pounded so hard she was certain it could be heard across the farmyard. Someone had actually come to investigate her situation. The moment felt surreal after weeks of believing herself forgotten and abandoned. "The Whitmore girl is here legally," Samuel protested, his voice rising defensively. "Her family entered into a voluntary arrangement to settle their debts. Everything was done properly." James Crow Feather spoke for the first time, his calm voice contrasting sharply with Samuel's agitation. "We'd like to speak with Miss Whitmore directly, if you don't mind. It's standard procedure to verify the working conditions and ensure that all parties understand their rights under territorial law." Martha emerged from behind the woodshed with trembling legs, her heart hammering against her ribs as she approached the group of men gathered in the farmyard. Marshal Brady was younger than she had expected, perhaps 30 years old, with sandy hair and the weathered complexion of someone who spent considerable time outdoors. His badge caught the late afternoon sunlight, lending him an air of official authority that made Samuel Henderson visibly nervous. "Miss Whitmore," Marshal Brady said, his voice gentle but professional, "I'm Marshal Brady, and I believe you've met Mr. Crow Feather. We'd like to ask you some questions about your living and working conditions here. Martha glanced nervously at Samuel, whose jaw was clenched tight with barely controlled anger. She had learned to read his moods over the past month, and she recognized the dangerous signs of his building rage. "Perhaps we could speak privately," James Crow Feather suggested, his perceptive gaze nodding Martha's hesitation. "There's no need for Miss Whitmore to feel uncomfortable discussing her situation." "Now wait just a minute," Samuel interjected, stepping closer to Martha in a gesture that was clearly meant to be intimidating. "This girl is under my protection and supervision. Any questions can be asked right here where I can ensure she's not confused or misled." Marshal Brady's expression hardened. "Mr. Henderson, I need to remind you that this is an official territorial investigation. Miss Whitmore has the right to speak freely without intimidation or interference." The tension in the air was palpable as the two men stared at each other. Martha found courage she didn't know she possessed, drawing strength from the knowledge that these men had come specifically to help her. "I can speak for myself," she said quietly, her voice steadier than she felt. "What would you like to know?" "Let's start with your living quarters," Marshal Brady said, pulling out a small notebook. "Could you show us where you sleep?" Martha led the group to the root cellar entrance, her cheeks burning with embarrassment as she opened the narrow door to reveal her cramped underground living space. The Marshal and James Crow Feather exchanged meaningful glances as they observed the dirt floor, low ceiling, and complete absence of basic amenities. "How long have you been sleeping here?" Marshal Brady asked, making notes. "Since I arrived 5 weeks ago," Martha replied. "Mrs. Henderson said it was warm and convenient to the kitchen." James Crow Feather crouched down to peer into the cellar more closely. "What about washing facilities, privacy, adequate ventilation?" Martha's silence spoke volumes. Samuel Henderson's face was growing redder by the moment, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "This is outrageous," he finally exploded. "That girl has been treated better than she deserved. We've fed her, housed her, and given her honest work. Her family was starving, and we saved them from destitution by purchasing their daughter like livestock." James Crow Feather's quiet words carried the force of a physical blow. "It wasn't like that," Samuel protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "It was a mutually beneficial arrangement." Marshal Brady stepped between the two men, his hand resting casually on his sidearm. "Mr. Henderson, I'm going to need to see the documentation for this arrangement. Contracts, payment records, correspondence with the Territorial Labor Office." Samuel's bluster deflated slightly. "Well, it wasn't exactly a formal contract, more of a gentleman's agreement between neighbors." "I see," the marshal replied dryly. And how much has Miss Whitmore been paid for her 5 weeks of labor? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Martha watched Samuel's face cycle through various expressions as he struggled to find an answer that wouldn't incriminate him further. Payment, Samuel Henderson sputtered, his face cycling between red anger and pale fear. The girl's room and board are her payment. Plus, we're holding wages to help her family through the winter. Marshall Brady's pen stopped moving across his notebook. I'll need to see those wage records, Mr. Henderson. Territorial law requires documentation of all payments, even when room and board are provided in lieu of cash wages. The silence stretched uncomfortably as Samuel realized he had trapped himself in his own lie. There were no wage records because there had been no wages. The arrangement had been exactly what James Crow Feather had called it, the purchase of a human being to serve as unpaid labor. Constance Henderson chose that moment to appear on the porch, her sharp voice cutting through the tension. Samuel, what's all this commotion? Martha has supper preparations to finish. Mrs. Henderson, Marshall Brady called out, we're conducting an official investigation into your labor practices. I'll need to speak with you as well. Constance's expression shifted from annoyance to alarm as she took in the scene. Her husband surrounded by law enforcement and a Native American man who clearly held some form of official authority. Her calculating mind quickly assessed the potential consequences of their situation. Investigation, she asked, her voice pitched higher than usual. What sort of investigation? We've done nothing wrong. James Crow Feather stepped forward, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the Hendersons' growing agitation. Ma'am, we're simply verifying that Miss Whitmore's working conditions comply with territorial regulations regarding the treatment of domestic workers. She's not a domestic worker, Constance snapped. She's working off her family's debt. It's a private arrangement. Private arrangements are still subject to territorial labor laws, Marshall Brady explained patiently. No one can be forced to work without fair compensation, regardless of family debts or other circumstances. Martha watched this exchange with growing amazement. For the first time since arriving at the Henderson farm, she was witnessing adults speak about her situation as if she were a human being with rights rather than property to be managed. The sensation was both liberating and terrifying. Miss Whitmore, James Crow Feather addressed her directly. Have you been free to leave this property at any time? To visit town, correspond with your family, or seek other employment? The question highlighted the reality of her captivity. Martha realized she hadn't set foot off the Henderson property since her arrival, hadn't written to her parents because she had no access to paper or postage, and had never been told she could seek other work. No, sir, she replied honestly. I was told I had to work here until the debt was paid off. And how much is this debt? Marshal Brady asked, his pen poised over his notebook. Samuel and Constance exchanged panicked glances. They had never specified an exact amount because they had never intended for Martha to work off the debt and gain her freedom. The arrangement had been designed to provide them with permanent unpaid labor. "Well," Samuel stammered, "it's not just the grain we provided. There's the cost of her room and board, the food she's eaten, the firewood she's used." "Mr. Henderson," Marshal Brady interrupted, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Are you telling me that you're charging this young woman for the privilege of working 16-hour days in your service?" The legal implications of their situation were becoming clear even to the Hendersons. They had essentially enslaved Martha under the guise of debt repayment, violating multiple territorial laws in the process. The confrontation reached its climax as Marshal Brady closed his notebook with an audible snap. The sound seemed to reverberate across the farmyard like a judge's gavel, marking the end of the Hendersons' attempts to justify their treatment of Martha. "Mr. and Mrs. Henderson," the marshal announced, his voice carrying the full weight of territorial authority. "Based on what I've observed and documented here today, you are in violation of several territorial statutes regarding the treatment of workers. Miss Whitmore's living conditions constitute unlawful confinement, and your failure to provide fair compensation violates labor protection laws." Samuel Henderson's bluster finally collapsed entirely. "Now wait, Marshal. Surely we can work something out. The girl's family was desperate. We helped them when no one else would." "By exploiting their desperation," James Crow Feather stated matter-of-factly. "Mr. Henderson, the territorial government and the tribal nations have been working together to eliminate exactly this kind of abuse. Miss Whitmore's situation is precisely what our new agreements are designed to address." Martha found herself caught between disbelief and overwhelming relief. After weeks of feeling invisible and powerless, she was witnessing justice being served on her behalf. The sensation was almost too intense to process. "What happens now?" she asked quietly, her voice barely audible above the afternoon breeze. Marshal Brady's expression softened as he addressed her directly. "Miss Whitmore, you are free to leave this property immediately. The territorial government will ensure you have safe transportation and temporary housing while we sort out your situation." "She can't leave," Constance Henderson protested desperately. "Her family owes us money. We have rights." "Ma'am," the marshal replied with barely controlled patience, "you have no rights that supersede Miss Whitmore's basic human dignity. Your so-called arrangement was illegal from the beginning." James Crow Feather approached Martha, speaking in the same quiet tone he had used during his previous visit. Miss Whitmore, if you're willing, the tribal nation can provide temporary housing and assistance while you decide what you'd like to do next. You're not obligated to return to your family if you don't wish to. The offer was more generous than Martha had dared to hope. Not only was she being rescued from the Hendersons' exploitation, but she was being given choices about her future, something she hadn't experienced since her father had first mentioned the family's desperate circumstances. "I'd like to write to my parents," she said, testing the boundaries of her newfound freedom. "They should know what happened here." "Of course," Marshall Brady agreed. "You'll have access to writing materials and postage. You can correspond with anyone you choose." Samuel Henderson made one final attempt to salvage the situation. "This is all a misunderstanding. The girl was well treated, well fed. Ask her yourself." Martha looked directly at her former captor, drawing upon reserves of courage she hadn't known she possessed. "Mr. Henderson, I was sleeping in a dirt floor cellar, eating table scraps, working from before dawn until after dark, and told I could never leave. If that's your definition of being well treated, then I pray no other young woman ever experiences your kindness." The words hung in the air like a condemnation. Even Constance Henderson seemed to grasp the futility of further argument. Marshall Brady gestured toward the root cellar. "Miss Whitmore, please gather your belongings. We'll escort you away from here immediately." Martha descended into the root cellar for the final time, her hands shaking as she gathered her few possessions. The cramped space that had been her prison for 5 weeks now felt like a tomb she was finally escaping. Her grandmother's Bible, the two faded dresses, her worn boots, and the silver locket that had sustained her through the darkest moments. These meager items represented everything she owned in the world. As she emerged from the cellar, Martha caught sight of the Henderson children peering from the house windows, their faces pressed against the glass in fascination. They had witnessed their parents' authority challenged and defeated, probably for the first time in their young lives. She wondered if they would learn different lessons about treating people with dignity, or if they would simply become more careful about hiding their cruelty. James Crow Feather waited beside two horses, having apparently anticipated the outcome of the investigation. His calm presence felt like an anchor in the chaos of emotions swirling through Martha's mind. Freedom was more overwhelming than she had expected, carrying with it uncertainties about the future that had seemed impossibly distant just hours before. "Miss Whitmore," he said gently, "I know this must feel overwhelming. Change often does, even when it's change for the better." Martha nodded, clutching her cloth bundle against her chest. "I'm grateful, truly. I'm not sure what comes next." "That's perfectly natural," Marshall Brady interjected, securing his notebook in his saddlebag. "You've been through an ordeal that would challenge anyone. The important thing is that you now have choices.